My name is Cara Hunt. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with the same handful of words: steady, polite, accommodating. I live in a city where ambition is worn like a tailored suit, and I married into a family that built its reputation on power, negotiation, and appearances. People usually underestimate me within the first 5 minutes of meeting me. I don't interrupt. I don't dominate conversations. I don't correct people publicly. I listen. And in rooms where volume is mistaken for authority, listening is often confused with weakness. I've learned to let that misconception breathe. This story isn't about dramatic revenge or explosive confrontations. There were no shattered glasses, no shouting across marble floors, no scenes worthy of a soap opera. What happened unfolded quietly, through contracts, conversations behind closed doors, and the slow realization that dignity is sometimes defended best without raising your voice. My father-in-law once offered me a fortune to disappear so my husband could marry a business partner's daughter. He presented it not as cruelty, but as opportunity, a mutually beneficial solution, a clean exit. When I declined, he calmly informed me that if I didn't take the money, he would destroy my husband's career and frame my parents for a crime. He said it the way someone might discuss a change in market conditions, measured, almost bored. I remember thinking how strange it was that he believed fear would move me faster than self-respect. This story is about what happens when someone assumes you are small enough to fold. It's about being assigned a role, supportive wife, background presence, expendable variable, and deciding, without announcement, that you will no longer perform it. There were moments of doubt, moments where silence felt heavy and obedience felt safer. There were long nights when I asked myself whether peace was worth the cost of my own erasure, but I made a choice. Not a loud one, not a reckless one, a deliberate one. Over the next hour, I'll tell you how that choice unfolded, how quiet became strategy, how invisibility became leverage, and how the people who thought they were controlling the board slowly realized the pieces had shifted. I won't dramatize it. I won't exaggerate. I'll tell you exactly how it happened, because sometimes the most powerful response isn't confrontation, it's clarity. Have you ever been placed in a role you never agreed to play? When I married Daniel Hunt, I didn't just marry a man. I married into an ecosystem. The Hunts were not loud in the way some powerful families are. They didn't need to be. Their authority sat in boardrooms, on letterheads, in the pauses between sentences when other people waited for their approval. To them, I was a detail, a pleasant one, decorative even. At family gatherings in Kensington, I was introduced as Daniel's wife, Cara. Never Cara who built her own consulting portfolio. Never Cara who graduated top of her class in media law. My identity was always positioned relationally, never independently, and I let it be that way. I had grown up in Manchester, the daughter of 2 teachers who believed stability was the highest form of love. When Daniel and I met during his MBA program, he was ambitious but kind. He talked about building something meaningful, not just profitable. I believed him. When we married, his father, Richard Hunt, gave a speech about legacy, about alliances, about how marriages, historically, have always strengthened families. I remember the subtle pause before he added, and of course, love. The room laughed politely. I did too. In their world, everything had a function, and my function was clear. I was the supportive presence, the one who remembered birthdays, who sent thank you notes, who softened Daniel's sharper edges at corporate dinners. I was the one who smiled when investors' wives made quiet assessments of my dress, my accent, my posture. I was useful. Usefulness is often mistaken for belonging. At business galas, I stood half a step behind Daniel. Not because he asked me to, but because that was the choreography everyone seemed to expect. Photographers would gesture him forward. I would adjust my clutch and let the flash pass over him. Richard once told a colleague within my hearing, "She's steady, not ambitious. That's good for Daniel. He needs calm, not competition." I wasn't offended at the time. I interpreted it as approval. Looking back, I realized he was categorizing me, placing me in a mental file labeled non-threatening. At Sunday lunches, conversation revolved around mergers, acquisitions, and expansion into Asia. When I offered an opinion, carefully phrased, backed with research, It was often acknowledged with a polite nod and then redirected. "That's interesting, Cara," someone would say. Anyway, as I was saying, the pattern was so consistent it felt normal. Daniel never dismissed me outright. He would squeeze my knee under the table when discussions grew heated, a private gesture of reassurance. But he rarely corrected his father, rarely insisted I be heard. I told myself it wasn't necessary, that not every room required my voice. I believed being underestimated was harmless, even convenient. It allowed me to observe without scrutiny, to learn the unspoken rules of their world. What I didn't understand then was that invisibility can slowly become erasure, if you accept it long enough. To them, I was the quiet wife, the stabilizer, the agreeable constant in Daniel's otherwise demanding life. They thought they knew exactly who I was, and perhaps at that time, so did I. The first time it happened, it was almost elegant in its subtlety. It was a Thursday evening in late autumn. Daniel and I had been invited to a private dinner at Richard's townhouse in Kensington. 8 guests, 2 investors, 1 long-standing business partner, and his daughter, Lila Davenport, fresh from completing her postgraduate degree at Oxford. I remember noticing how deliberately she was seated beside Daniel. I told myself not to read into seating arrangements. Dinner conversation drifted toward a potential joint venture between Hunt Holdings and Davenport Logistics. Shipping infrastructure. Strategic expansion into Northern Europe. I had spent the previous week reviewing a public white paper on the industry purely out of curiosity. It intersected with some media regulations I understood well. At one point, Daniel hesitated while discussing regulatory hurdles. Without interrupting, I leaned slightly forward and said, "If you structure the subsidiary under a Dutch holding company, you could reduce exposure to certain compliance redundancies. It would streamline approvals." The table went quiet, not shocked, just still. Richard looked at me over the rim of his wineglass. "That's quite technical, Cara," he said lightly. "Where did you pick that up?" I smiled. "I've worked with cross-border compliance cases before. It's not so different." Lila tilted her head. "Oh, I thought you did editing." "I do," I replied, "but primarily for legal publications." There was a pause, a small one, but it lingered. Richard turned back to Daniel. "We'll have the advisory team look into structural efficiencies. Best not to improvise at the dinner table." The conversation shifted. No one challenged him, not even Daniel. Under the table, his hand found mine briefly. A squeeze. Apology without words. I withdrew my hand gently. It wasn't humiliation, not overtly. No one raised their voice. No one mocked me. But something had been established in that moment. My competence was incidental, decorative, not authoritative. After dessert, as guests moved toward the drawing room, I passed Richard near the hallway mirror. He adjusted his cufflinks and said, almost conversationally, "It's admirable that you take an interest in Daniel's work. Just be careful not to blur lines. Men don't enjoy feeling corrected." His tone was not angry. It was instructional. I nodded politely. Of course. Later that night, in the car ride home, Daniel was unusually quiet. The city lights streaked across the windows like elongated thoughts neither of us wanted to voice. "You were right about the Dutch structure," he finally said. "I know," I replied gently. He exhaled. "Dad doesn't like surprises." I wasn't trying to surprise him. "I know." That phrase again. I stared out the window, replaying the dinner in my mind. Not the words, but the energy. The way Lila had watched. The way Richard had measured. It wasn't about the suggestion. It was about boundaries. I had stepped unknowingly into a space they did not believe belonged to me. And instead of defending that step, Daniel chose to smooth it over. That was the first small cut. Not deep enough to bleed, but sharp enough to leave a mark only I could feel. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw in anger. I simply made a quiet note in the slim, leather-bound notebook I carried in my handbag. Do not mistake proximity for inclusion. At the time, I thought it was a reminder about dinner etiquette. I didn't yet realize it was a warning. After that dinner, nothing changed, which is precisely how normalization begins. There were no dramatic exclusions, no explicit corrections. Instead, there were subtle adjustments. I was no longer asked about my work in group settings. If I offered insight, it was acknowledged with a smile and redirected with efficiency. It became choreography. At one Christmas gathering, Lila arrived with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She and Daniel stood near the fireplace discussing shipping routes, while Richard observed with visible approval. I approached with mulled wine for everyone. "Cara," Richard said warmly, "you're always so thoughtful." The tone suggested a compliment. It wasn't. I listened as Lila spoke confidently about European port acquisitions. When Daniel mentioned regulatory timing concerns, I felt the familiar impulse to clarify something technical. This time I didn't. I took a sip of wine instead. Daniel glanced at me once, almost expectantly, as if waiting for me to contribute. But when I remained silent, he returned his attention to Lila without hesitation. That was the moment I understood something unsettling. My silence created less friction than my competence, and friction in that family was unacceptable. Over the following months, I began to rationalize. Richard came from a different generation. He valued hierarchy. It wasn't personal. Daniel was under pressure. Challenging his father publicly would complicate things. It wasn't fair to expect him to mediate every nuance. Lila was simply ambitious. It wasn't her fault if the family admired that in her. Every small dismissal found an explanation. At a spring charity gala, a journalist mistakenly referred to me as Daniel's assistant. I corrected him gently. Before he could apologize, Richard interjected with a chuckle. "She practically is," he said. "Keeps him organized." The table laughed. I smiled. Later, Daniel kissed my temple and whispered, "He didn't mean it." Meaning I was learning was irrelevant. Impact was quieter. I began to notice patterns in seating arrangements, in invitation lists, and in who was CC'd on certain emails when I occasionally helped Daniel draft correspondence. Lila's name appeared more frequently. Mine disappeared entirely. One evening, I overheard Richard on the phone in his study while I was waiting for Daniel downstairs. He didn't know I was within earshot. "The Davenport alliance would be seamless," he said. "The families align perfectly." A pause. "Yes, Daniel's married, but these things can be resolved." Resolved. The word stayed with me like a cold draft under a door. When Daniel came down the stairs, I said nothing. I watched him adjust his cufflinks, an unconscious habit he had inherited from his father. In that moment, I recognized a dangerous truth. I was being positioned not as a partner, but as an obstacle. A temporary detail in a larger strategy. Still, I didn't confront him. Why? Because I believed love required patience. Because I trusted that if something truly crossed a line, Daniel would defend me. Because acknowledging the pattern would mean accepting that I had married into a negotiation, not a family. And so I adapted. I became more agreeable, more composed, less visible in professional conversations. I told myself that marriage wasn't a competition, that security was more valuable than pride. What I didn't understand was that each compromise made the next one easier, for them, and more expensive, for me. Disrespect doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives politely, repeatedly, until you begin to question whether it exists at all. By the time I stopped questioning it, it had already reshaped the room. It happened gradually, the way most roles do. No one hands you a script. You just begin performing it because it keeps the room calm. By our 3rd year of marriage, my function within the Hunt family was unmistakable. I was the stabilizer, the soft presence, the one who remembered everyone's preferences. Richard's preference for Darjeeling over Earl Grey, Lila's allergy to almonds, and the exact way Daniel liked his calendar color-coded. I handled the domestic diplomacy. I drafted holiday messages on Daniel's behalf. I hosted investor wives for discreet lunches where the unspoken expectation was charm, not intellect. And I did it well. Richard began introducing me differently. Not as Daniel's wife anymore, but as the glue. "She keeps everything smooth," he'd say approvingly. Smooth. Smooth meant compliant, predictable, non-disruptive. At first, I accepted it as a compliment. Stability is valuable. Emotional intelligence is rare. But slowly I realized that my competence was only welcomed when it operated behind the curtain. If I managed a delicate social conflict, I was praised. If I analyzed a strategic flaw, I was redirected. The boundaries were invisible but firm. One afternoon, while organizing documents in Daniel's home office, I noticed a draft proposal on his desk, Hunt Holdings and Davenport Logistics, formally titled as a Strategic Family Alignment Initiative. The language was clinical, but the subtext was unmistakable. The proposal outlined potential benefits of consolidated leadership through familial integration. I read the line 3 times. Familial integration. I didn't need a legal background to understand what that implied. When Daniel returned home that evening, I asked about it calmly. No accusation, just curiosity. "It's hypothetical," he said quickly. "Dad drafts dozens of exploratory frameworks." "Does Lila know about it?" I asked. He hesitated for half a second too long. It's not serious. That wasn't an answer. But I didn't push, because pushing would make it difficult for me. And difficult women in that family were liabilities. Instead, I began to observe my own behavior with uncomfortable clarity. I was anticipating their expectations before they voiced them. I was moderating my intelligence to maintain harmony. I was shrinking in rooms where I had once felt expansive. One Sunday lunch, Richard handed Lila a folder at the table. "For your review," he said. Fresh perspective. He had never handed me a folder. Not once. I felt something shift then, not anger, not jealousy. Recognition. I wasn't being excluded because I lacked capability. I was being excluded because my inclusion disrupted a narrative they were constructing. The narrative required Daniel to appear unattached to independent influence, available, strategically flexible, and I was inconvenient. That evening, as I placed my leather notebook on my bedside table, I wrote a single sentence. "They don't want me gone yet. They want me quiet. Understanding your assigned role is unsettling, but it's also liberating, because once you see the script, you can decide whether to continue performing it." At that point, I was still playing along. I just hadn't realized the audition for my replacement had already begun. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after a threat. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Daniel had left early for a meeting. I stayed behind at Richard's townhouse because I'd promised to review seating arrangements for an upcoming corporate anniversary dinner. A trivial task, technically. Strategic, socially. Richard was in his study with the door slightly ajar. I wasn't trying to overhear him, but certain tones cut through walls. His voice was low, controlled, the kind he used when discussing leverage. "Yes," he said into the phone. "Daniel's competent, but perception matters. The Davenport connection would solidify things. The wife? She's manageable." A pause. "If necessary, transitions can be arranged discreetly." Transitions. I stood in the hallway, holding a folder embossed with the Hunt family crest, feeling something inside me become very still. Not shattered, not wounded, just still. There's a moment when reality stops asking for your permission to see it clearly. That was mine. I didn't storm into the study. I didn't confront him. I didn't even let my breathing change. I walked to the guest sitting room instead and sat down. For the first time, I allowed myself to stop rationalizing. This wasn't a generational misunderstanding. It wasn't social awkwardness. It wasn't a harmless preference for hierarchy. It was a strategy, and I was an expendable variable within it. The clarity was almost calming. Painful, yes, but clean, like cold air in winter. I thought about Daniel, about his silences, about the way he avoided direct answers when I asked about Lila. I didn't believe he wanted to replace me, but I also knew he wasn't confronting his father's positioning. Neutrality in power dynamics is rarely neutral. Sitting there, I realized something else. I had been trying to prove I belonged in a room that had already decided my function. Belonging cannot be negotiated from a position of self-erasure. For years, I had equated peace with virtue. I believed endurance was strength, but endurance without boundaries becomes permission. I opened my leather notebook. My handwriting, usually fluid, felt deliberate as I wrote. If they are strategizing, so am I. Not as revenge, not as retaliation, as alignment with reality. That morning, I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't search Daniel's messages. I simply began observing differently. I started noticing which documents were left casually on desks. Which conversations ended abruptly when I entered a room. Which legal advisors visited the townhouse and how often. Patterns emerge when you stop being emotionally invested in denial. When Daniel returned home that night, he kissed me hello and asked about the seating plan. I handed him the finalized layout. Efficient, flawless. "You're amazing," he said absent-mindedly. I smiled, because that was the last day I operated purely from trust. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I stopped assuming love was protection. Something had shifted quietly inside me that morning. I wasn't leaving, I wasn't confronting, I wasn't panicking. I was recalibrating. And the most dangerous person in a power imbalance isn't the one who shouts. It's the one who becomes very, very clear. After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. Before it had been protective, an attempt to preserve harmony. Now it was observational, deliberate. There's a difference between being quiet because you feel small and being quiet because you are measuring the room. No one noticed the shift. Why would they? I was still agreeable, still efficient. Still, the woman who remembered everyone's dietary preferences and drafted thank you notes that sounded warm without being intimate. But internally, I had stopped seeking approval, and that altered everything. At dinners, when Lila spoke confidently about expansion models, I watched not her, but Richard. I observed which comments made him lean forward, which made him dismissively tap his fork against porcelain. When Daniel avoided eye contact during certain conversations, I noted it, not emotionally, factually. I began to understand that the Hunts operated on leverage. Information was currency. Silence was power. Appearances were a strategy. So I adapted. If they believed I was harmless, I would remain harmless, on the surface. One evening, Daniel mentioned casually that his father was restructuring some executive roles within the company. A precautionary adjustment, he called it. Precaution against what? I asked gently. Market volatility, he replied too quickly. I nodded. I didn't challenge him, but I checked the company's house filings later that week. Quietly, legally, publicly available documents often reveal more than private conversations. There were preliminary adjustments in share allocations. Subtle, not alarming, but strategic. Lila's family trust had increased advisory influence. I closed my laptop without visible reaction. Silence when chosen creates space, and space allows you to see structure. I also began to revisit my own foundations. My freelance work had always been steady but secondary. I expanded it without announcement. I accepted larger contracts, increased my consulting rates, diversified my investments. Daniel noticed the busier schedule. I didn't realize you were taking on this much, he said one night. I've always been capable of it, I replied calmly. He smiled as if it were charming. He didn't ask further. That was the pattern. They mistook my composure for compliance, my quiet expansion for a hobby, my documentation habits for personal organization. What they didn't understand was that I was building optionality, not escape, not retaliation. Options. The more they positioned me as replaceable, the more I ensured I was not dependent. There's a peculiar strength in being underestimated. People speak freely around you. They reveal intentions because they assume you lack the capacity to respond strategically. One afternoon, while Richard and Daniel were in the study, their voices carried faintly through the hallway. It needs to be clean, Richard said. No scandal, no mess. And Cara? Daniel asked. A pause. She'll understand when the time comes. I stood in the kitchen, steadying my breath. Understand what? The phrasing told me everything. There was a plan. And in their version of it, I would eventually be informed, not consulted. That night, I opened my notebook again. Silence is no longer avoidance, it's preparation. I wasn't angry. Anger clouds timing. I was patient. And patience, when paired with clarity, becomes strategy. They believed I was waiting to be told my fate. What they didn't realize was that I had already stopped waiting. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. I didn't hire private investigators. I didn't search phones or set traps. Everything I did was legal, methodical, and quiet. The Hunts respected structure. So I operated within structure. First, I organized. For years, I had been the one managing household correspondence, scanning documents, archiving warranties, tax returns, and insurance updates. It was invisible labor. No one thought twice about it. I began categorizing more carefully. Corporate invitations, draft agreements accidentally left in shared printers, revised memorandums Daniel forwarded to our home email for convenience. None of it is confidential in the criminal sense, but revealing in context. Patterns emerged. Richard wasn't simply exploring an alliance with the Davenports. He was accelerating it. Joint appearances, coordinated philanthropic donations. Subtle media placements describe the two families as increasingly intertwined. Public narrative often precedes private action. I started clipping those articles, saving timestamps, archiving screenshots, not because I planned to expose anyone, because documentation is leverage. Simultaneously, I met with a solicitor, quietly, under the pretense of updating my will, which I did. But I also asked broader questions about marital assets, share structures, and reputational risk within corporate families. I framed everything hypothetically. What protections exist, I asked calmly, if a spouse were pressured to exit a marriage for strategic business reasons. The solicitor didn't seem surprised. London had seen stranger negotiations. I left that office not with panic, but with clarity about my rights. At home, I became even more agreeable. When Richard praised Lila's fresh strategic mind, I nodded. When Daniel worked late with her on integration models, I left tea outside the study door. They interpreted this as resignation. It was positioning. The more harmless I appeared, the less guarded they became. One evening, during a small investor dinner, Richard made a comment that shifted everything from suspicion to certainty. "We value loyalty," he said, raising his glass. "But sometimes growth requires difficult adjustments." His eyes flicked toward me for half a second. That glance was not accidental. It was diagnostic, measuring whether I sensed the trajectory. I smiled softly and raised my glass in return. Inside, I cataloged the moment. What they never noticed was that I had begun diversifying, not just financially, but socially. I reconnected with former colleagues, accepted invitations to speak on editorial panels, quietly rebuilt a professional identity that existed independently of Daniel's surname. I also transferred certain personal investments into structures that could not be influenced by marital pressure. All legal, all documented. Daniel once joked, "You're more organized than our compliance department." He thought it was an affectionate exaggeration. He didn't realize it was true. There is a specific power in preparing without declaring war. No threats, no ultimatums, just architecture. And while they were planning my transition, I was ensuring that any move they made would carry consequences. Not emotional ones, but structural ones. Because here's what powerful men often forget. When you treat someone as a variable, you assume they lack agency. And agency, when quiet, is difficult to detect. By the end of that summer, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready, not to attack, but to respond decisively when the offer finally came, because I knew it would. The offer came on a gray Wednesday afternoon. Richard didn't summon me to the townhouse. He invited me to lunch at a private members club near St. James's. Neutral territory, controlled lighting, controlled audience. When I arrived, he was already seated, silver cufflinks perfectly aligned, posture relaxed. He stood politely, kissed my cheek as if nothing in the world were misaligned, and gestured for me to sit. We ordered tea, not wine. That detail mattered. "Cara," he began smoothly, "you've always been intelligent." Flattery, I had learned, is often a prelude to repositioning. He spoke for several minutes about market pressures, long-term stability, and legacy planning. It sounded almost philosophical. I let him finish. Then he folded his hands neatly on the table. "There's an opportunity," he said, "for everyone." The word landed softly. He explained that Hunt Holdings and Davenport Logistics were finalizing a binding strategic alliance. The families would be permanently intertwined. It would secure generational influence. The media would frame it as visionary consolidation. "There is, however," he continued, "a personal complication." He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. He described it as an unfortunate misalignment of timing. Daniel's marriage, our marriage, complicated optics. Investors preferred clarity, clean narratives. "And Lila?" I asked quietly. He held my gaze without blinking. "She understands the bigger picture." Of course she did. Then he placed a thin leather folder on the table between us. Inside was a settlement proposal, a property transfer, a substantial financial arrangement, lifetime security, confidentiality clauses, non-disparagement terms. The language was elegant, surgical. In exchange, I would initiate a divorce citing irreconcilable differences. No scandal, no accusations, a dignified exit. "And Daniel?" I asked. "He will be protected," Richard replied. "His trajectory will accelerate." The implication was unmistakable, with Lila beside him. I closed the folder gently. "I'm not interested," I said. He didn't react, not visibly. Instead, he leaned back slightly and studied me as if recalculating a forecast. "You should consider carefully," he said calmly. "If this proceeds without cooperation, outcomes may become less controlled." I met his eyes steadily. "What does that mean?" His voice remained level. "Daniel's career depends on alignment. Investors dislike instability, and reputational matters can be complicated." A pause. "Your parents," he added almost casually, "have always seemed respectable. It would be unfortunate if regulatory inquiries touched the wrong people." There it was. Not shouted, not dramatic. A threat. Destroy Daniel's career, frame my parents for a crime. He said it like a man discussing rain probability. Detached from morality, focused only on leverage. For a brief second, I felt the old instinct to appease, to negotiate, to preserve peace at any cost. Then I remembered my notebook, The months of documentation, the legal clarity, the architecture I had quietly built. I didn't raise my voice. I appreciate your transparency, I said evenly, but coercion is rarely as clean as it appears. A flicker crossed his expression, subtle, curious. You overestimate your position, he replied. No, I said softly. I've measured it. We finished the tea in silence. When I stood to leave, he added one final line. Think carefully, Cara. This is the most generous outcome available. I walked out into the London air feeling something unexpected. Not fear, not rage, clarity. The private reveal wasn't the offer. It wasn't even the threat. It was the confirmation that everything I had sensed was real, deliberate, structured, and now, finally, visible. They believed they were presenting me with my only option. What they didn't know was that I had already chosen a different path, one that didn't require shouting, only timing. I didn't tell Daniel about the lunch. Not immediately. That might sound cold, but timing matters when power is uneven. And in that moment, I needed to understand one thing clearly before I moved, whether my husband was complicit or merely compliant. There's a difference, and it changes everything. That evening, Daniel came home later than usual. He looked distracted, restless in a way that didn't match his words. Dad mentioned you two had lunch, he said casually while loosening his tie. So Richard had informed him. Interesting. Yes, I replied evenly. We discussed the future. He didn't ask what that meant. Instead, he walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stood with his back partially turned toward me. Cara, if things shifted a bit in the coming months, strategically, I'd want you to trust that it's for long-term stability. Stability, the word again. For whose stability? I asked gently. He hesitated. Just long enough. Everyone's. That was the moment the decision crystallized. Not because he confessed, not because he endorsed the threat, but because he didn't ask what his father had said to me. He didn't ask whether I was okay. He didn't show curiosity about why I might look different that night. He had already chosen alignment. Maybe he told himself it was temporary. Maybe he believed he could manage the fallout later. But neutrality, when someone is being coerced, becomes participation. I went to our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed with my notebook in my lap. There were 3 options in front of me. First, take the money. Protect my parents preemptively. Walk away quietly. Second, confront Daniel emotionally. Force a moral reckoning. Risk panic, denial, escalation. Third, act structurally. The third option was irreversible. It meant shifting the balance in ways they would not anticipate. It meant accepting that my marriage might not survive, not because I failed, but because I refused to be repositioned like an asset. I wasn't afraid of losing comfort. I was afraid of losing self-respect. If I accepted the settlement, I would live securely, but always knowing I had been priced. If I begged Daniel to choose me over ambition, I would reduce myself to persuasion. No, I chose something else. I chose documentation over emotion, structure over reaction, law over leverage. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I opened my laptop and drafted a timeline. Dates, conversations, public statements linking the Hunts and the Davenports, the lunch proposal, the implied threat against my parents. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I recorded. Then I emailed my solicitor requesting an urgent meeting. Subject line, strategic marital protection. The next morning, I called my parents, not to alarm them, but to update them gently on financial safeguards. I advised them to review their own documentation, their own tax filings, calmly, proactively. They didn't question me. They trusted my tone. Because here's what Richard misunderstood. Threats work best when the target is emotionally reactive. I wasn't reactive anymore. I had crossed an internal line the moment Daniel chose silence. The decision wasn't about revenge. It was about refusing to be cornered. And once you refuse that, truly refuse it, the rest becomes execution. I closed my notebook and turned off the light. From that moment forward, everything I did would be deliberate. They believed I was considering their offer. In reality, I had already moved past negotiation. The first rule of structural action is this: you never announce it. You execute it while everything still looks normal. The morning after my decision, I met my solicitor in a quiet office overlooking the Thames. I brought my notebook, the settlement folder Richard had given me, and a timeline of events. No theatrics, no accusations, just facts. She read everything carefully. When she reached the clause outlining confidentiality in exchange for financial compensation, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. And the implied threat? She asked. I documented it, I replied. I don't need to prove intent. I need to ensure protection. That was the key. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was building insulation. We discussed legal boundaries, coercion, reputational liability, corporate governance responsibilities. If a company executive was involved in pressuring a spouse through implied defamation or false allegations, it carried significant consequences. Not criminal necessarily, but civil. Shareholder consequences. Regulatory scrutiny. Richard's power depended on clean optics, so I built contingencies that threatened optics, not with exposure, but with structure. We filed a formal legal record, sealed confidential, documenting the settlement offer and the associated language. Not public, not yet, just time-stamped. I also initiated a review of our marital asset framework. Quietly, transparently, Daniel received a standard notification that we were updating estate planning structures. Perfectly reasonable. Financial hygiene. He didn't question it. At the same time, I reached out to a trusted former colleague, now working in corporate compliance advisory. Casual conversation. Hypothetical scenarios about reputational risk during mergers involving family businesses. Information flows easily when it doesn't sound like a complaint. Meanwhile, at home, nothing changed outwardly. I still set the table, still attended dinners, still smiled at Richard with measured composure. If he was expecting desperation or negotiation, he didn't get it. One evening, he asked lightly, "Have you considered the proposal?" "I have," I replied. "Thoroughly. And I believe clarity benefits everyone." I watched him try to decode that answer. He couldn't, because clarity doesn't reveal timing. Behind the scenes, my solicitor prepared a protective notice, again, confidential, stating that any attempt to damage my parents' reputation through fabricated claims would trigger immediate civil action and regulatory review. It wasn't a threat. It was a mechanism. Mechanisms make powerful men uncomfortable. Daniel, meanwhile, sensed something different but couldn't articulate it. "You seem distant," he said one night. "I'm organized," I corrected gently. He laughed softly. "You've always been organized." "Yes, but now my organization includes exit routes, asset clarity, and documented leverage. The most significant move I made was this. I arranged a private financial structure that secured independent liquidity beyond marital influence. Fully legal, fully transparent to tax authorities, invisible to family pressure. Freedom is louder in theory than in practice. In practice, it's paperwork. By the end of that month, every threat Richard had implied was neutralized structurally. He didn't know it yet, but the board had shifted. And the most dangerous thing for someone accustomed to control is realizing too late that control has boundaries. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was a canceled meeting. Daniel came home one evening, unusually tense, and mentioned that a key investor had requested clarification regarding certain governance structures tied to the Davenport Alliance. "Probably routine," he said, but his jaw was tight. Routine questions rarely rattle confident men. Within 2 weeks, additional inquiries surfaced. Not accusations, not scandals. Just be careful procedural scrutiny around conflict of interest disclosures and executive conduct transparency during merger negotiations. No one mentioned my name. They didn't need to. When governance documentation becomes meticulous overnight, people notice. Richard called an emergency board discussion. Lila's family advisors postponed a press announcement about the strategic familial integration. The phrase disappeared quietly from draft communications. Invisibility, I had learned, works both ways. One Sunday lunch felt different. The atmosphere was thinner, less triumphant. Richard spoke more cautiously. Lila asked fewer confident questions. Daniel seemed distracted. No one understood why momentum had slowed. But momentum had slowed, because once a confidential legal record exists documenting coercive settlement language, corporate counsel becomes conservative. Risk calculations shift. Advisors become alert to potential reputational exposure. No accusations had been made, but the architecture had changed. One evening, Daniel confronted his father behind closed study doors. Their voices weren't loud, but sharper. "You didn't tell me she'd react like this," Daniel said. "React like what?" I wondered quietly. "I handled it appropriately," Richard replied coolly. "She was offered generosity. And now compliance is asking questions," Daniel shot back. There it was. Not panic, but disruption. The machine wasn't moving as smoothly anymore. Later that night, Daniel approached me carefully. "Did you speak to anyone?" he asked. "I ensured my rights were documented," I said calmly. His eyes widened slightly. "Cara, you've complicated things." "Have I?" I asked gently. He looked at me as if seeing something unfamiliar. Not anger, not fear. Boundary. The consequences weren't explosive. They were procedural. Delays, reviews, legal caution. Richard stopped mentioning timelines. Lila's public appearances with Daniel became less frequent. Media speculation cooled because nothing official materialized. Power thrives on forward motion, and forward motion had stalled. The Hunts weren't collapsing. They were recalculating. That was the beginning of the shift. For the first time since the lunch at St. James's, Richard requested a private meeting with Daniel's legal team present, not to threaten, to understand exposure. He had underestimated one thing: I wasn't fighting emotionally. I was introducing risk variables into his clean equation, and powerful men dislike variables they didn't authorize. At home, Daniel grew quieter. He watched me differently, less dismissively, more cautiously. "You've changed," he said one night. "No," I replied, "I've clarified." The consequences were subtle but irreversible. The alliance slowed. The narrative fractured. And for the first time, Richard no longer spoke about the future as if it were predetermined. He spoke about contingencies, and contingencies meant he finally recognized that I was not removable without cost. By early autumn, the tone had shifted completely. What was once confident expansion became cautious delay. What had been framed as visionary alignment was now described internally as under review. No headlines announced failure. No public fallout occurred. But inside the rooms that mattered, momentum had fractured. Richard invited me to the townhouse again, this time not to negotiate, but to recalibrate. He didn't offer tea. He didn't bother with philosophy. "We may have misjudged the pace of certain decisions," he said evenly. "This doesn't need to become adversarial." Adversarial. The word revealed more than he intended. "I never positioned it that way," I replied calmly. His gaze sharpened, then removed the pressure. There it was. He understood now that the compliance inquiries, the governance scrutiny, the hesitations from Davenport advisors weren't a coincidence. They were consequences of risk documentation, of legal timestamps, of a potential narrative that no corporation once attached to a merger. Coercion. "I haven't applied pressure," I said. "I've applied protection." For the first time since I'd known him, Richard looked uncertain, not frightened, but forced to adjust. Meanwhile, Daniel was unraveling quietly. His performance reviews remained strong, but promotions paused. Senior leadership expressed concerns about optics during transition periods. Lila's involvement in strategic meetings decreased. Her father's tone cooled. Ambition doesn't collapse dramatically. It erodes when confidence weakens. One evening, Daniel sat across from me at our dining table and finally asked the question he should have asked months earlier. "What exactly did my father say to you?" I looked at him carefully. "He offered me a settlement to disappear," I said evenly, and implied that if I refused, your career and my parents' reputation could be complicated. Daniel went pale. "He wouldn't." "He would," I replied gently. "He did." The room felt very still. "I didn't tell you immediately," I continued, "because I needed to know whether you would choose clarity on your own." He stared at the table. "And I didn't, I didn't," he whispered. It wasn't an argument, it was recognition. By that point, the alliance with the Davenports was effectively frozen. Investors didn't want controversy, potential or otherwise. Corporate counsel recommended distance. Richard requested a joint meeting with Daniel and me, not to threaten, to repair. But repair requires trust, and trust had already shifted. "Let's find a solution," he said in a tone that finally lacked certainty. There was no shouting, no accusations. Just a quiet understanding that the timeline he had engineered no longer existed. The problem wasn't that I had destroyed anything. The problem was that I had introduced accountability into a plan designed without my consent. And accountability, once present, cannot be undone. By the time Richard realized the cost of coercion exceeded the benefit of consolidation, it was too late. Not because I sought punishment, but because I refused to be maneuvered. The board had changed. The narrative had shifted. And some structures, once exposed to scrutiny, never returned to their original shape. The final meeting took place on a Monday morning. No raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums. Just 3 people sitting across a polished oak table in Richard's study. Daniel is to my left. Richard is at the head. The sunlight filtered through tall windows, diffused by London's usual gray. It felt almost symbolic. Nothing harsh, nothing theatrical, just clarity. Richard began. I miscalculated, he said evenly. I believed you would prioritize stability over resistance. I did prioritize stability, I replied. Just not the kind you meant. He studied me carefully. There was no contempt in his expression now, only reassessment. You understand, he continued, that this disruption has cost us momentum. Yes, I said. And attempting to coerce me would have cost more. Silence settled between us, not hostile, evaluative. Daniel finally spoke. Dad, you should have told me everything. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. You would have hesitated. That's the point, Daniel replied quietly. For the first time, the dynamic shifted in plain sight. Not because I attacked, but because Daniel saw the architecture that had formed around him. Richard turned back to me. What do you want? It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question. I answered without emotion. Transparency. And distance from any strategy that treats my existence as negotiable. He nodded slowly. The alliance with the Davenports is suspended indefinitely. Indefinitely. Not cancelled, but neutralized. And Daniel? I asked. He remains in his role, Richard said, on merit. Merit. A word that had felt optional before. There were no apologies. Richard was not a man built for overt remorse. But something more meaningful happened. He acknowledged limits. I underestimated you, he said simply. Yes, I replied. No bitterness, no triumph, just a fact. The conversation lasted less than an hour. When we stood to leave, Richard extended his hand, a formal gesture. I shook it, steady. There was no reconciliation ceremony, no emotional resolution, because the real confrontation had not been between Richard and me. It had been internal, between the version of myself that would have accepted pricing and the version that refused it. As Daniel and I walked back to the car, he stopped beside the pavement. I should have protected you, he said quietly. I didn't need protection, I replied. I needed you to see. He nodded. The heat people expect in confrontations never arrived. There was no explosion, just acknowledgement. An acknowledgement, when it comes too late to reverse events, becomes a lesson rather than a solution. The power dynamic had changed permanently, not because I won, but because I did not bend. People assume that moments like this end in one of two ways. Either the marriage collapses dramatically, or everything returns to normal, softened by apologies and renewed vows. Reality is quieter than that. Daniel and I did not separate immediately, nor did we pretend nothing had happened. What we did instead was harder. We rebuilt with uncomfortable honesty. Trust, once cracked, doesn't shatter loudly. It fractures along invisible lines. You don't repair it with romance. You repair it with accountability. Daniel stepped back from his father's shadow more deliberately. Not rebelliously, strategically. He restructured his reporting lines, diversified his influence within the company, so that no single voice could reposition his life without scrutiny. I didn't demand it. He chose it, and choice matters. As for Richard, our interactions became formal but measured. He no longer spoke about alliances in coded language around me. He no longer treated my presence as a temporary variable. Respect arrived not as warmth, but as caution. I accepted that. Something else changed too. I stopped shrinking. At corporate events, I spoke when I had something relevant to say. Not defensively, not competitively, just clearly. When conversations drifted into territory, I understood. I contributed without apology. And something unexpected happened. No one interrupted, because once you demonstrate that you are structurally aware, people recalibrate their assumptions. My professional life expanded. Invitations to consult grew more frequent. I accepted a permanent advisory role with a publishing consortium, independent of Daniel's sphere. Not as retaliation, as alignment with who I had always been. The biggest shift, however, was internal. I no longer equated peace with silence. I no longer believed endurance alone was a virtue. I understood that calm boundaries are stronger than emotional reactions. Richard once told me months later, "You play a long game." I smiled gently. "No," I said. "I just don't play games at all." That was the truth. I didn't win a battle. I clarified a position. The woman they thought was manageable turned out to be measured. The wife they assumed would accept pricing turned out to understand valuation. And I discovered something about myself in the process. I am not invisible unless I choose to be. I'm not quiet because I am weak. I'm quiet because I am deliberate. And there is a difference. Today, when I walk into rooms once structured without me in mind, I no longer wonder whether I belong. Belonging is not granted. It is carried. If you're waiting for a triumphant ending, this isn't one. No one was publicly exposed. No headlines unraveled legacies. No dramatic justice scene unfolded under bright lights. What happened was quieter. A powerful man miscalculated the woman he believed he could reposition. A husband learned that neutrality has consequences, and I learned that dignity does not require noise. It requires structure. My father-in-law offered me a fortune to disappear. When I refused, he threatened to dismantle my husband's career and damage my parents' reputation. He assumed fear would move me. It didn't, not because I am fearless, but because fear without preparation is panic, and fear with preparation becomes clarity. The most important lesson wasn't about corporate politics or family alliances. It was about self-valuation. When someone tries to price you, they reveal how they see you. But you reveal who you are and how you respond. I could have taken the settlement and lived comfortably. I could have fought emotionally and created chaos. Instead, I chose documentation. I chose patience. I chose structure. And that choice shifted the outcome without spectacle. Here's the truth I carry now. You don't have to shout to be powerful. You don't have to humiliate anyone to establish boundaries. You don't have to destroy something to prove you can't be destroyed. Sometimes the strongest response is calm refusal paired with quiet action. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt like a variable in someone else's plan, if you've ever been told that keeping the peace was your responsibility, I want you to know this. Peace without respect is just delayed conflict. What would you have done in my position? Would you have taken the money or chosen something harder? I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspective.